of those young adult fellowship gatherings that the idea for this lecture came about. Lorenzo was talking to us about a course he recently taught at SDSU entitled Understanding Evil. Very popular, very provocative course. But even more intriguing than the title was some of the content, which included things like demons, hell, Satan, vampires, among other things. And so we thought, what better topic for Sunday morning? But in particular, we wanted to explore how religious communities grapple with the idea of evil, and more specifically, how our faith community continues to approach this challenge. It's not an easy topic to squeeze into an hour, particularly when he usually teaches this over the course of a semester. So we're very lucky to have him give us that sampler this morning. I think it promises to be an interesting dialogue. There's going to be a PowerPoint so you can kind of follow along, and we should have some time for questions at the end. So anyway, without further ado, thank you again to Professor Nericcio. I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Sterling. Hello, everybody. How's it going? Okay, so like Sterling said, this is some of the class that I teach. This is, but with a much more Christian bent to it, because when I teach this, I don't like start preaching to my students, because that would be a little inappropriate. But I do, at least the beginning half of it is definitely consistent with what I teach in this class, and then we'll have a novel Christian solution at the end. I will warn you, it gets a little, we're Episcopalians here, so it might look a little dicey. It's going to come through in the end, don't worry. But yeah, so the problem of evil. Okay, so the problem of evil is really simple. It's like a classic problem in philosophy and theology. People have been arguing about this since like the Greeks, even before they had like monotheistic, Christianity style religion. But it's basically just bad stuff happens. Why is it like that? I always worry about this. I hate when bad things happen of any kind. And we might really worry if God is good, as we understand him to be. Why is that the case? So here's when I'm doing philosophy, it's good to set up like a definition, right? When you're doing just general, any kind of philosophy, you want to define your terms kind of, clearly. Now, we probably can't define God exactly, right? And I think it would probably be wrong to try in some sense. But this is at least some attributes that are usually given to God, or the way that we describe God in philosophy and theology. So these are called the omnis. You'll often hear this kind of depiction of God called the omni-God or the philosopher's God, because it's this sort of logical construct, right? You imagine a being who has these attributes. He's omnipotent, he can do anything, right? That's what God does. Omniscient, he knows everything. And he's omnibenevolent, which is a sort of tortured construction, but it just means morally perfect or all good, right? Okay, so that's the setup. Okay, so if that's the case, right, we might worry again, why do bad things happen? How would it be possible for bad things to happen? Because if God is good and can do anything and knows everything, he should be able to intervene, or at least prevent in the first place any bad things from having happened. There's two ways that this question gets posed, or two kind of lenses through which you might think about it. The first is a metaphysical question. So metaphysics and philosophy, people use the word metaphysics often to mean something like, I don't know, crystals or astrology and stuff. That's not quite right. I mean, common usage is whatever it is, but in philosophy, metaphysics is ultimate construction of reality. When you're asking a metaphysical question, you mean, what's this made out of, really, at bottom? And so the metaphysical question about the problem of evil is, why is evil even part of the world to begin with? So you might imagine God's making the world, he's baking a cake, right? He's putting in trees and rabbits and planets and good, and then evil also. Why would that happen? That's basically the way to think about it. Then there's an empirical question, which is basically okay, metaphysical problem aside, maybe we can solve that, which there are some good solutions to, which we'll talk about. How do we explain the particular evils that do happen? A lot of people will call this also the inductive problem of evil because you might think that, yeah, maybe we can't know for sure that God does or doesn't exist, but the presence of badness in the world seems to give evidence to the thought that God doesn't exist. Okay, how we doing? Bearing with me? All right. One more distinction to make that we should think about, and that's the distinction between moral evils and natural evils. So it might be a little confusing. I realize every once in a while that I'm calling all of this like bad stuff evil, and this is kind of like an old way of talking about it. Like medieval philosophers would talk about it this way. Usually when we say something or somebody is evil, we mean like a moral evil, right? Like a murderer or a serial killer. My students often write about serial killers. They seem to really capture the public imagination. But things like economic injustice, we could call climate change a kind of moral evil. It's something that humans have the ability to think about and then do, right? Like it's we consider things a moral evil when somebody has like a sort of premeditated or at least like agent style relationship with the deed that they perform, like a murder. Natural evils are things that just happen. Right? Like nobody wills there to be an earthquake. Cancer is not caused by a person, at least not in normal cases. These are the kinds of things that just happen. Like it just is part of the world. Like it's part of our existence to be vulnerable to these kinds of things. And it runs a range from like catastrophic natural disasters to tummy aches, but all of those kind of count as basically a natural evil of some kind. Okay. So here is the argument from evil, which is an argument used in philosophy, usually by atheist philosophers, to use this observation that there's evil in the world as the basis for a reason to doubt that God exists, right? So philosophers love doing this. They love doing numbered arguments this way. And so this is how the argument goes, right? If God exists, then God is those omnis. If he's omnipotent, he can stop evil. If he's omniscient, he knows where the evil is, and he's morally perfect, then he should want to stop evil, right? Like we all presumably do. If we're morally good, we want to intervene on some bad thing that's happening. But evil does exist, and if evil exists and God exists, then either God isn't one of the omnis, and then you get the conclusion God doesn't exist from this. Right? This is a very tight little classic philosophy argument. And this is kind of like the basis this is like a formal version of what we'll be working with here. Again, like I said, it's going to look a little dicey. We're going to get through it. This is it. Okay. So, sorry. Let me motivate this a little bit more. So, like again, this is the thought. If you're making a universe like from scratch, like you are building a universe from the bottom up, you can do anything, right? You could make the world absolutely perfect. You could make it like imagine like a children's book, right? Like nothing really bad happens in a children's book. Maybe there's like a little bit of a conflict, but that's just for fun. At the end of the day, the world could have been like that. Like theoretically, God at the beginning of time could have made the world really, really nice, including like animals suffer all the time. Like the world is full of animal suffering all the time. Why is it like that? That's really like, let that motivate you for a moment, because I think that's the core of this argument. Okay, so let's look at some like historical solutions that have existed to this problem before I do my solution to this problem, which is not listed here. But that's got to pay fair due to the existing literature. So the first solution is some Augustinian metaphysics. So you all probably know St. Augustine. He was like a North African Roman guy from the 3rd century. But if you've ever read Confessions, which is great, I really recommend that. That's like one of my favorite things to read and teach, is Augustine's Confessions. And it's a story about his like coming to faith. He presents a solution to this problem. And his solution is, I don't know how much y'all know about Plato's forms, but Plato has an idea, or like the philosopher Plato, believed that the ultimate metaphysical reality of our world was determined by these things called forms. So for any object, like a chair or a tree or a person or morality, there was a form, like a sort of like object in the heavens, which was the most perfect version of that. And then like the actual chair that's like you're sitting on right now is just a sort of like reflection of the sort of like source code background information that is then, this is like an example. Okay, so Augustine's solution is using that kind of Platonist architecture, or that kind of Platonist metaphysics, in order to motivate his solution. So you wouldn't say that, like, on the Platonic view of forms, that a chair that's poorly built is like, it has like a property of badness in it. You would just say it's lacking certain good qualities. If it's uncomfortable, then it's lacking maybe a cushion that the most perfect chair would have. Okay. Well, in that case, badness, like defects, are not actual objects. They're not actual features of things. They're just lacking of features. So the way that I explain this to my students often is like, imagine like a bagel or a donut. The hole in the middle is not a piece of the donut, right? It's a place where there isn't donut. And so Augustine's solution is basically that. It's like there's goodness in the world, and all the goodness in the world and everything that's close to goodness is given by God. But places where there's evil, like any kind of evil at all, is distance from God. It's a hole, basically. It's a place where there isn't the fabric of God reaching everything. And so there isn't actually any such thing as evil. There's not like an object or an actual entity that you could refer to as evil. It's just a lack. Okay. It's a little tricky. It's a little bit of what one of my professors in undergrad would call philosopher magic. But it works. It's kind of cool. Like, it's a fun solution. My students really like it. I think most of the Christian ones do, and other like Abrahamic faith students like this one. But it's pretty good. However, you might worry that like why would God allow that to happen, right? God could have made a bun instead of a bagel, and instead it seems that the world still has holes in it every once in a while. Now, Augustine's answer to this kind of concern is basically it's free will, which we'll talk about in a second. We need the ability to distance ourselves from God and in return so that we can have that freedom to act morally well, which is necessary for the kind of relationship that we want with God. But that doesn't really explain natural evils very well. And you might still, like, why, you know. When you, like, for example, one of my students wrote a very good paper, I thought, that sort of like just forced this intuition a little bit. Like, when you're seeing something horrible happening, when somebody does something truly morally heinous, or whenever somebody gets like a terrible disease, it's hard to see that as like, oh, that's just like a place where God isn't. Like, it seems like there is something there, some sort of evil, some sort of suffering that's really there. It's not just a lack. So there's some concerns with this solution. I don't think it's like totally unviable, but I'm not very persuaded by it personally. Let's talk about free will. So this is probably like the most, I call it like the generic Christian answer to like why bad things happen. It's just because people have free will. Like, you know, some people might say there are Christian philosophers who make really complicated arguments trying to show that like the good that we have in free will is so good that it is worth any bad things that happen because of it. And that is part of just what it is to be human, or, you know, it's part of what the gift of life that God has granted us. That's fine as far as it goes, but it doesn't go very far because it completely leaves natural evils untouched and unexplained. Like, if the only bad things that ever happened were stuff that humans did, this would be fine. But that's not the case. Like, people get diseases and horrible natural disasters happen, accidents happen that nobody's responsible for. And that doesn't feel like, well, we could have had free will without that being the case. It's hard to imagine, but remember, we're dealing with an all-powerful God. He could have made the world like anything at all. So it's hard to see how free will is a sufficient answer to, like, the fact of other kinds of evil, natural evils. Okay, so that's, you know, that's part of it. And then you might even say, like, people maybe don't even actually have free will, or at least not in the way that's morally necessary for this kind of thing. We won't worry about that, but that's another line of objection to this that we'll leave untouched for the moment. Okay, so this is the most complicated one, and I'm running absolutely roughshod over this, so please forgive me if you're well versed in this stuff. This is just terrible, but it'll do for the moment. So another kind of example of like broad categories of answer is what I call like there must be a balance of good and evil kind of views. This is a little bit more of like, I think, sophisticated kind of response. For example, people who are influenced by kind of like Eastern thoughts, including people who are from like Hinduism or Buddhism, often consider, well, like, no, it's just part of the way that the world is. You need there to be a balance of good and evil. If you believe that there's like a circle of life, like remember earlier when I was talking about how bad it is that animals die, you might think, well, that's fine, that's just the circle of life. You need that. You need the rabbits to get eaten by the foxes because the foxes need to live. It didn't have to be like that though. Like all animals could have eaten grass. So, you know, like, but we'll get to that. So like that's like one way of cashing this out. There's also people who kind of think, I could say like Stoic or Stoic adjacent. So Stoics were Roman philosophers that kind of had this very like mindset first way of interacting with life where, you know, there's not anything that's inherently good or bad. It's just our own, the way that we think about it and interact with our life that makes things good or bad. And so with the right mindset, with the right kind of discipline, you can make good anything. So, or at least in theory, or at least you can see that there is goodness to still be observed even in the most difficult situations. Now, that's like one kind of general like family of beliefs. And the last one that's kind of related to that is like a kind of epistemic argument, which is that we need to know badness in order to know goodness. This is a common one too. Like we wouldn't know pleasures without pains. You know, like hunger is the best seasoning. That kind of view, but expanded to life in general. That we just need some knowledge of suffering in order to really enjoy life's goodness. But as I've written there, like the basic problem is that like it didn't have to be like that if you're dealing with the omni-God that we characterized a bit ago. Like it could have been that we just knew what goodness was like without having to suffer. And actually, plausibly, we kind of do. Like people can enjoy pleasures without knowing what the like equal and opposite suffering degree is. But it didn't have to be that animals ate each other. It didn't have to be that there like was this balance between good and evil. It could have just been good. And so we're still left with that basic question, like why? Why is it like that? Like why are we in a world where these bad things happen if it didn't have to be that way? That's the thing that we've got to keep holding on to here. Is like why would it have to be that way? All right. And of course the last like solution is just to be an atheist. That's funny, people just take that route and say, okay, well the problem of evil does it. There you go. Or, as written small there, you could like drop one of the omnis, and you end up with a weird kind of like, yeah, I don't know, like other sort of religious view where you like a God who's not all powerful but is all knowing and all good, or something like that. That's actually kind of where St. Augustine started in a view called Manichaeism, which sort of posited that there's good and evil forces in the world that are constantly at war with each other. I actually had a student who like adopted Manichaean theology for her. She was like a Christian, I guess. Yeah, she was. And but she was like, no, but the devil is the reason why they're suffering in the world. And like he isn't like an opposite force to God. It works, like the mechanism works just fine, but I feel like it's a little bit not what we want as Christians to be like, well, yeah, anything bad that happens, we'll just blame it on the devil. It feels, it's at least not very Episcopalian. No. Okay, so what is the solution? And I've really dug us deep into a rabbit hole here. And for a while, like in my own life, I was like, yeah, okay, yeah, something like that must be true. But I think there's a way out. It's not like easy, but let's work with it. So let's look at the Bible. Let's actually, it's hard to say scripture here. So Job is one of my favorite books in the Bible. It might be my favorite one. Maybe the Gospels are better. But like I love the book of Job. It's like even when I was not a practicing religious person, I love the book of Job. He just gets it. The book just gets it. And it really deals with this problem. right? Like this is, in fact, everything that we've been over so far, okay, it's not like literally contained within the book of Job, but the ethos of it, I think, is already basically in there. So the basic premise, you know it, God and the devil make a bet, and then God takes away all Job's stuff. And Job remains faithful, despite the fact that he's visited upon with all of these tremendous different sufferings. The important, like the middle part of it, like the bulk of the book, is just Job's different friends coming and trying to give him different explanations for why this might have happened. Different ways he failed to be faithful, different ways that maybe actually is as good as part of God's plan. And that's like most of it. But then at the end, Job's like, enough, I'm going straight to the boss to find out what happened here. And that's my favorite part. I hadn't read this in a long time, and then I reread it, and I was laughing so much reading it because it's funny, it's beautiful, but it's beautiful. So like so Job finishes asking, and God says this: "Who is this that obscures my plans with words without knowledge? Brace yourself like a man. I will question you, and you shall answer me. Where were you when I laid the earth's foundation? Tell me if you understand. Who marked off its dimensions? Surely you know. Who stretched a measuring line across it? On what were its footings set? Or who laid its cornerstone, while the morning stars sang together and all the angels shouted for joy?" And this is just God, like, just really kind of poking fun at Job here, because Job's like asking, like, hey, why did this happen? And God's like, do you know how the earth was made? My favorite part is he goes on, he's like, do you know where donkeys have their babies? Do you know where mountain goats hang out when you're not looking at them? And Job's like, please, why did you kill my family? And God's like, do you know about the goats though? And that's like what his response is. And it's so beautiful. Like it really, I genuinely say that. Like I love this passage because it's like that, you know. Like when we suffer in life, when we come upon like just horrible things that happen, and you turn and you look at the world and go, why is this happening? There's just an inherent absurdity to it as well. And I think that's just so well recognized here. And the message, insofar as you can glean one, of course this is a matter for interpretation, it's a kind of humility. Because Job was right. Like the whole time, all of his friends were giving him these explanations. They were wrong. They were all wrong. God does not say, oh yeah, Bildad actually, he got. No, he was wrong. The rest of them were wrong. Even Elihu at the end, who seems to give the most sophisticated explanation, was still wrong. And the answer is just a kind of humility. Job comes to God and God's like, you can't know about that. Basically. Although there's a kind of, you can also sort of glean it, a kind of like beautiful, has no choice but to be, like, lay himself in front of God's mercy. And it works out for him. So that's I think probably more orthodox or like common big takeaway is that we really are, our best bet is to lay ourselves in front of God to accept his mercy, his grace. But we're Christians, so we know that the story doesn't end there. And this is where we're going to get, this is where now we divert from anything. I don't do this exactly with my students, because students are going to get a little preachy. But here's how it works. Okay, so the next thing to think about in the movement of these different stories as we work through the Bible is Jesus, right? I mean, it's not like the next book, but it's a good place to go after this. And in the incarnation and the crucifixion, we see a very new type of God than the God that is presented to us in the book of Job. Essentially, or like really crucially, it's a God that's willing to sacrifice himself / his son for our own salvation. But I think it's very important that we don't understand this as a kind of transaction, right? So that's one way of presenting it. It's like, we sinned a lot. We needed God to fix that, so he sent his son. There it is, debt cleared, right? But I think that's a little bit misguided as an understanding of the kind of sacrificial love that we see the God of the New Testament presenting. I put here sort of cheekily that that's something Job's friends would believe, and I think that's right. Like that kind of substitutionary atonement view is very like, we can negotiate and understand God's rules, and we'll just play by those rules, and then we got it. And it's very Bildad kind of energy. Like that's not quite right, I don't think. And so I really like the thoughts of the formerly Anglican, then ultimately Catholic. Well, he's dead now, but that's his life trajectory. Lay theologian G.K. Chesterton, which is just a really brilliant insight. I'm going to read you a really long quote, so forgive me if I mess up a couple times, but it's so good, it's really worth it. Okay, so this is in his book Orthodoxy, which is kind of his own description of how he came to really buy into Christianity fully. But in the terrific tale of Passion, there is a distinct emotional suggestion that the author of all things, in some unthinkable way, went not only through agony, but through doubt. It is written, "Thou shalt not tempt the Lord thy God." No, but the Lord thy God may tempt himself. And it seems as if this was what happened in Gethsemane. In a garden Satan tempted man, and in a garden God tempted God. He passed in some superhuman manner through our human horror of pessimism. When the world shook and the sun was wiped out of heaven, it was not at the crucifixion, but at the cry from the cross, the cry which confessed that God was forsaken of God. And now let the revolutionists choose a creed from all the creeds and a God from all the gods of the world, carefully naming all the gods of inevitable recurrence and of unalterable power. They will not find a God who has himself been in revolt. Nay, the matter grows too difficult for human speech. But let the atheists themselves choose a God. They will find only one divinity who ever uttered their isolation, only one religion in which God seemed for an instant to be an atheist. And he's referring here to the moment where Jesus is on the cross and says, "My God, why have you abandoned me?" I just think that's so good, because in that moment, Jesus knows Job's position. Like, Jesus is in that full position of, like, I just don't get it. Why is this happening? And that's, like, really powerful. I think I feel like it's kind of unique to Christianity. I worry a little bit about, there's a bit of Christian chauvinism in this, saying, like, you know, it's like, who else has got a God who does that? But it is very cool, and I love that about the Christian tradition. There's this moment where the God that we are orienting ourselves toward knows the same depths of pessimism and despair that we might in moments of doubt of that God. Really like brilliantly reflexive and subjective sort of representation of the divine. Okay, so a few things. First, I love that. I really recommend the book. It's kind of, he writes in a very like stuffy British man manner, which I unfortunately really like. Other people don't like that so much, but if you like it, it's great. But we see here, right, that the God of Job isn't just this distant architect of the universe who sort of is like, yeah, sorry, man, you don't know how goats are born. Like, this is not for you. To one that is one with our despair in its depth. And as we learn from Job, this is where it gets a little tricky. Suffering isn't like good or right or part of just a plan. It just is, right? This is the really big takeaway. This is like the terrifying takeaway from Job, is that God doesn't say, aha, it was part of my plan to have you suffer, which is for some greater good. That's not it. It's just there. That's our interaction with this. It just is. I put a little joke here. If the suffering of Christ were good in itself, and we have the Romans to thank for saving us from our sins, because they did it, they sacrificed it for us. But it's not in that. It's not like we're like, yes, thank God we had that like transaction with God, where God paid off our sins by sacrificing His Son through like the point of service terminal that was the Roman Empire. Like, that's not really the right way to think about it. And so, and this is where it gets kind of off the rails, I don't think that reasoning, like of the kind that we've been doing so far, this kind of like heavy philosophical logic chopping, is the right tool to approach this problem. I don't think that we can get there using that. I'm kind of pessimistic about the power of reasoning when it comes here. And I think that's what we're supposed to understand from Job and from the Gospels too. Okay, so basically we're still in Job's position. Like I said, we didn't get out. We didn't, like Job's theological friends, our way out of the situation that we described at the beginning. But we have something else, which is the hope of resurrection through the redeeming love demonstrated by Christ, which is not like a matter of reasoning. It's not a thing that we logic our way to. That love is one of frailty and vulnerability and courage, right? That's the position Jesus is in. One of my most my foes in the world are these kinds of Christian theological bros who understand the crucifixion to be this thing where it's like, oh yeah, he was so tough, he endured that tough, hard workout on the cross for us. And I think that's just dead wrong. The Jesus of the cross is in a deeply vulnerable and frail place. But in that moment, also knows the kind of courage that you can only know in that position of vulnerability. And importantly, we're asked to follow him. And that, again, it's not something that we reason ourselves to. I truly don't believe that that's right. I think it's something we just have to emotionally prepare ourselves to do. And so something that one of my friends likes to say that her kind of motto to herself is to embrace the mystery. And I really like that. I think that's right. There is just a mystery in this. We don't know why suffering happens, not in some intellectual way that we can think through and provide a satisfactory logical answer to, but we're still called to love in the midst of that. And that's just how it is. I really love the little exhortation that the priests say after the announcements every week, to walk in love as Christ loved us and gave himself for us, an offering and sacrifice to God. I think that's just it. That's just, I love that so much. I get chills sometimes listening to that. I think that's just right. You just have to do that. Like, oh, why is there badness in the world? That's why. Or like, no, that's just the answer. That's the response, the reconciliation. And so the problem of evil isn't really like solved. It's not like, again, it's not like a math problem that you can just sort out. It's not, I guess the thing that we learn, or at least the position that I adopt from this, is that we don't worship the omni-God as outlined earlier. We worship a God of vulnerability and love and hope in the midst of and despite the human condition. And beyond that, it's kind of just a mystery. But I think that's a good thing, because it means that it's more of like an emotional sort of way of importing ourselves in the world. It's a way of interacting with each other and with life that goes beyond like, aha, like we figured it out. I mean, this is like what faith is supposed to be for, right? Like we would have no need of faith if we could just do the math and figure out, oh, okay, God is real, we did it. And I think the kind of faith that we're called to is this kind of just love in the midst of vulnerability. So I think that's it. There's my sources. I forgot to cite Augustine, but Augustine's there too. I also recommend this book, On Philosophy of Christ, by the philosopher Slavoj Žižek. It's really, really annoyingly written. It's very difficult to read. He's a terrible writer, but it's really good. It's like really smart. And this general ethos is kind of what he's looking for, although he's ultimately an atheist. Okay, that's that. We have plenty of time for questions, right? Yeah.
Could you go back to that last, so that we could
Yeah, please.
Type it or whatever. Thanks.
Yes.
Well, thank you. That was beautiful and very wise.
Oh, thank you.
What actually reminds me of C.S. Lewis's Chronicles of Narnia.
Yeah.
His mother died, and he goes to Africa, and Aslan cries. And
Yeah.
in fact, the tears in Aslan gives Sigrid the courage to stand up to the evil witch.
Yeah.
How much does she understand?
Yeah.
And then, the other, just on the reason level, I remember hearing Mortimer Adler talk once at the Aston Institute, and he tried to prove the existence of God.
Yeah.
You know, sort of, and then his point was, well, how many people believe in God because of this proof? People can raise their hand.
Yeah.
His point was
Right.
that this is the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, what is going on.
Yeah.
And I think he illustrated that too.
Oh, thank you very much. I appreciate that. Yeah, I think that's right too. Like I recently was talking with some friends about this, and we were looking at like different, because there are like logical proofs for God. Like people do actual, like, it looks like math, like symbolic logic to try to prove God exists. And I'm just like, has anybody ever been convinced by this? Like seeing the argument and gone, all right, we go to church then. Or like you read that and you're like, okay, I guess the Southern Baptist Convention then is where I gotta go. Like that's where, that's just not how it goes. It's a very deeply personal and emotional thing.
And then I think there's another quote in the Listen to Problem of Pain, that the problem is that people either pay too much attention to evil or not enough. So,
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah.
going back to your premise, I got a lot of help from Aquinas, who said that when we use words like love or God is just, God is good, we don't know what those words mean when they're applied to God. And that really helped me a lot, because God's a mystery to us. The thing I wanted to say too was I happened to be at Princeton Seminary for my 45th reunion, and New Testament professor there was really interested in religious experiences. He's been collecting them and all this. And so many people, near-death experiences, or they had a horrible injury or accident, and then they have this experience of total bliss.
Yeah.
And I don't know what to make of that, but there's something to that, I think, that maybe all this melts away at a certain point.
Yeah.
In the mystery of God's love. I don't know.
Right. No, I mean, I think, that sounds right.
It's another angle on it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I guess another way of feeling that emotion. Yeah.
So if the ultimate answer is that there is no answer, or that we'll never really know, what is the virtue in continuing to ask the questions and continuing to engage these difficult questions?
I think it's like, there's a few different philosophers who've kind of thought about that. And I think Pascal comes to mind. So the French philosopher Blaise Pascal was he was an atheist, but he wanted to be religious, but he couldn't do it because it was dang, this is crazy, and I'm a science guy. But he used, for example, are you familiar with Pascal's wager? It's if you believe in God and God does exist, you go to heaven, and if he doesn't exist, then nothing happens. If you don't believe in God and he does exist, then you go to hell. So it's like a game theory sort of it's optimal to believe in God, right? But he didn't convince himself using that argument. He used that argument, among others, to try to force his rational brain into a position where it was ready to submit to just being religious. And I think that's kind of the value sometimes, if there is any value, which for the really complicated logical arguments that exist out there, I actually think they're kind of misdirect, or they lead us astray in some sense, because they kind of take us away from the nature of what we really should be focusing on, which is love. But at least insofar as they have some utility, thinking through these kinds of logical arguments, maybe you can prep with a sort of overly rational person to accept the kind of love that you need to, if you need that kind of thing to do it. Yeah.
So the problem of evil emerges because apparently God doesn't have a very Christian attitude.
Sure. Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Could do something about natural evil being prohibited, but it doesn't. If I understand you rightly, you're advocating humility here. You just can't understand. Where was it? Someplace Paul takes this platonic position that one day, the other side of eternity, we'll understand things from the point of view of eternity, and we'll see things, that everything works for good in terms of God's plan for the universe. But that does strike me as kind of Pollyannish too. That doesn't sound like a very adequate solution. So the idea then is to have humility and to go on to other issues, perhaps combating moral and natural evil as best we can do, given our earthly plight.
Yeah, if you're gonna render this into a kind of practical solution, or okay, what's the practical takeaway from the ethos that I've sort of sketched here, then yeah, I mean, what does walking in love mean? Probably a lot of harm reduction in some cases, right? And trying to do good when you can. Or at least I think that's right. But honestly, it's still a bit of a mystery. It's something I'm still thinking through. What the actual logical entailments of this kind of mysterious humility might be.
So what then would be your response to an agnostic or atheist who pretty much gives up on the traditional notion of theism, an all-caring, all-knowing God?
Yeah.
The existence of natural evil seems to contradict that faith.
Yeah. I think I would just try to be as loving as possible in your presence. I think that's the answer. I had a joke, or I was joking with a friend when I was talking about this, that I hate when they do debates. When you get you got an atheist and a Christian, and they're going to debate the existence of God, and they're good. And like, here's the thought. The atheist is like, haha, like here's my argument from evil, and like it doesn't work, like or it works perfectly. There's no such thing as God. The Christian response to that should be, I love you. Like that's, I think that's it. I don't think that there's like, that there is like a response in terms of, like let me outline principles that demonstrate the rationality of my approach.
Atheists are also capable of arguing too.
Yeah, they are. So much the closer to God for it, I think. Yeah.
Well, what you're saying reminds me too that we're all on a journey, and we have different ways of getting to wherever we're going, and there are a lot of paths. Maybe some people need to have those kinds of conversations with others or internally.
Right.
And eventually we get there. We're great, right? Perfect.
Right.
Or they won't. The other thing I was thinking when you were talking about natural disasters, that I think sometimes, that this is in my little brain right now, but we don't know what the intelligences are of anything beyond people. We don't even know our own, right? And the earth also, some people think, has a living, breathing presence. So maybe that's partially an explanation. I don't know. That there's a sense of free will within every living thing.
Oh, I see. Oh, that's clever. I like
I'm just throwing it out there.
I like that as a fun novel. Yeah.
Well, you just sprang that thought.
Yeah.
That's fun. Sprang the thought.
Yeah, I kind of agree with that because I really like the presentation and the way that you solution to it. If you think about it, it's a very anthropocentric view of it because God is God of the whole world. And to the tiger who eats the man is a tragedy for the man, but it's a deal for the tiger. And and so we can't understand it. It's not going to. I don't think it's understandable. But we have to do like you said and take actions based upon improving things. But if we don't do that, or sometimes when we do that, it improves things for us at the expense of others, like nature or animals or even other people.
Right. Yeah, I mean that's also just a difficulty of our fallen position.
Yeah.
Accident.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. I saw your hand first. Yeah.
Can you comment on intentionality as a part of evil? It's been said that stupid people are more dangerous than evil people.
Right.
I won't go over there. We know what we're talking about.
Yeah. It's that's so complicated. There's so surely in most of the cases we think that people who do things wrong on purpose are in some sense morally worse than people who do them by accident. This is why manslaughter is not as bad as premeditated murder in the legal system that kind of reflects those moral intuitions. There are people who don't agree with that view, or you might think you have an obligation, like a meta obligation, to not be stupid so that you don't do harm, and so by letting yourself be stupid in such a way that causes harm, you end up doing a moral wrong too. It's a complicated question as far as assigning blame goes. Yeah, there's a whole the moral philosophy of agency is really deeply concerned with that kind of thing. Yeah.
Okay. If you have a small child and they're stacking blocks and they're doing it wrong, so you go up and you restack the blocks for them, they never learn at all how to do it.
Right.
Wouldn't a way to keep an omni-God just take out the interventionist part? He's doing it so we can learn.
Oh,
He's not
yes.
intervening. He's
Good.
not restacking our blocks.
Yes, that's another way of doing it. You can have a kind of deism sort of view. The responses to that I've heard are, one, God does seem to be some sort of an interventionist if he sent Jesus. But then the other thought with that is, why make it so that we needed to learn? We could have been, imagine however you imagine heaven. Why couldn't God just have made the world like that to begin with? And just that's it. That's the whole thing.
Yeah, according to Scripture, God did.
Oh, right. That's true.
We choose to play with the blocks.
I got checkmated. Yeah.
Well, we're made in his image, and as you said, when Jesus was on the cross questioning himself by questioning God, why have you forsaken me? God had to learn that lesson too.
Right.
So if he's teaching himself and we're all teaching ourselves, wouldn't it just show that we are further in his image?
Yeah, but that's good. But I think that image then is also omniscient. You know, if you had to learn something.
Well, you said that was your argument, that he forsook himself.
Right. Yeah, but I'm not trying to defend that. Yeah. But if you wanted to, that would seem to be a problem. That he would have to learn something. It seems inconsistent with omniscience. Because there wasn't something at some point something he didn't know. That's the concern. But yeah.
Well, that just reminded me again, going back to the Chronicles of Narnia.
Yeah.
The time when
Witch tax.
Edmund has gone bad, hooked up with the witch. And
Yeah.
his older brother Peter says, well, I gotta go out and save him and, listen to the witch and, put things right. Mr. Beaver says, no, you have to go to Aslan.
Right.
You're gonna make it worse if you try to solve the problem.
Yeah.
Sort of underscoring the point that, we're partners, and if we try to do it ourselves, we're, like probably create more trouble.
Right. Yeah.
So,
I gotta go back and reread those. That's one thing I'm taking away from this. Yeah.
I can ask I agree, Job is one of my favorite books in the Bible. And I want to know, is it just gratuitous that after Job understood that he did not have the omniscience of God, that he was blessed with all these material possessions? It kind of seems to me that understanding was worth more than any material recompense he could have. Job could have stopped there.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it could have too, actually. It would have been really interesting if it had stopped there. I don't have a good response to that.
I have two things on that exact note. One, that probably is just the original ending of the Job story, and all the beautiful poetry that Lorenzo was speaking about, and the exchanges between the 4 friends and then God are all a much later addition. And so the story really was just Job's a great guy. God does terrible things in cahoots with Ha-Satan.
Yeah.
Job gets it all back because because Job says, "The Lord giveth and the Lord taketh away." All the stuff we love in between is a much later addition, and a brilliant poetic addition that speaks to us forever. Which does lead to perhaps suffering is a way we discover more about ourselves in the first place, and the refining process by which not that means all suffering is good.
Right.
Not the point, but that it helps us find more about ourselves and our society and the people around us. So,
Or it could be that they think the rabbis added the happy ending on at the end to sort of make the story make some sense. Because it didn't make sense to them. So the last chapter, I think number 40, is our later rabbinic edition they believe in. So.
It just seems to me that one's understanding of God vis-a-vis his all-knowing, and you're seeing things from your own perspective, supersedes all other knowledge that we have. But I agree with you. Everybody likes a Hollywood ending.
Even work that way. I saw your hand and then come back to you.
I think that final ending on Job I've read was a tack on, because the story in some sense was unsatisfactory. Much as the Gospel of Mark, the abrupt ending was unsatisfactory, and there were 3 or 4 Adams.
Right.
We want completion.
Right.
And living in mystery and living in doubt is tough for people, I think.
I think that's right. I don't know the history of the construction of the Book of Job. So I can't speak to that directly.
Going back to Shakespeare, who I'm not a lot of insight.
Yeah.
Well, the idea of the speed of the use of diversity. But I remember hearing a very remarkable lecture about Lear. And, this is King Lear, and he's really suffered, and this was pre-Christian, and because of his suffering, when his daughter Cordelia dies, he has this brilliant insight that she will be resurrected. She will come to life. And so that's like this, the idea really is that through suffering, then you come to know God, and as opposed to the view of the Gloucester, who, we are the God that like lies for lots of boys and kills for their sport.
Right.
It's sort of cynical.
Right.
So it's sometimes it's necessary, but through suffering, we gain wisdom of God.
Yes, I think that's like a good example of the kind of like this view. That one, I think that seems to be the general view there. Is like if suffering has some purpose that we need it for, for something, I think it's going to fall into this general bucket of response.
It's been a long time since I've read the Confessions, and I remember that Augustus was a Manichaean. What made him change?
There was like a bishop who came to speak, and he was like really good at arguing, I think.
Mhm.
And then Augustine was like, "Oh, Manichaeanism is not good," because I think like mechanically, I think the reason he didn't like it was because it would imply that God is not all powerful. Because there would be an equal and opposite evil force in the world, which is what Manichaean theology sort of constructed. Yeah.
But that's also the point of Job, that, through his suffering, maybe it's the additional poets mentioned, but, the worms destroyed this body, yet in my flesh will I see God. I mean, that's resurrection theology.
It is, yeah. But I don't think it's like it's a legitimation of the suffering itself. Or at least that's not the way that I read it. It's like, it's not like, oh, actually it's good that because that's the key move that I think we can make after reading Job is saying like, oh, there isn't like a good thing from the suffering that was wrought by the suffering. It's like, it's a message of humility, and that humility must be satisfied without repayment for what was bad. I mean, the repayment that he gets at the end is like, one way of reading is God's just like, here, have some stuff, because I'm nice like that. But it's not because I took your stuff away. It's just you got also, I was gonna give it to you anyway, but yeah.
All will be well.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
I'm just going to say that
Yeah.
the end of the story is, with Job, feels like what he's given back is relationships. The goods were there too, but
Right.
but he got a new family.
Right.
He lost his whole family, so I'm just
Yeah.
it's significant.
Right. Although I did always find that a little weird. It's like, oh, all right, it's my new kids now. Like, this will be fine.
Life goes on.
But I'd like to underscore that point, because beforehand, Job didn't really have that much of a relationship with God.
Right.
And it was sort of like, good deeds will, get me, will lead to prosperity.
Right. Right.
Yeah,
But it's not the good deeds that leads to the prosperity. It's
Yeah.
just the grace of God. The
Paradox.
utterly mysterious, unintelligible grace of God. Cool. Thanks so much, everybody.
So from Plato to Job to Jesus and everything in between. Thank you, Lorenzo. Thank you, everybody, for attending this morning. As a reminder, there is no Sunday Forum next Sunday, Pentecost. We will be back in 2 weeks. Thank you again, Professor Lorenzo, and happy Sunday.
Thank you.